Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us here today. And and today we're talking about happiness. Happiness. Is everybody happy? And now when I was a kid growing up in the 50s, television was a relatively new medium, probably, less than 10 years old, which meant there wasn't a whole lot of content or a whole lot of programming that was unique for television yet. They were still trying to figure out what to do with it. It was kind of that period where TV actually tried to put on plays and do something theatrical and something having good theatrical values. Uh, I remember when I was a kid growing up, my mom still listened to the soap operas on the radio because that's where they were, of course, before TV. So she would turn her radio on and tune it to whatever station broadcast her favorite soap operas, and they were radio dramas, and just several people standing in a room in front of microphones with scripts, reading from the scripts. And you've probably seen the old movies. They just, when they read the page, they just throw it on the floor so they don't get back to it by accident. And it was only years later, as I was growing up, that the soap operas transitioned from the radio to the TV. And I would come home from school. I would come home from lunch every day. We didn't have a cafeteria at school. We would walk home, get a sandwich, and go back to school. And I would come home, and my lunch would be ready for me. It would be on the table, and Mom would be in front of the TV with her handkerchief out, crying along with her soap operas. But when I was a kid, because there was such little content, I don't know if you remember, at night the TV stations went off the air. They played a Star Spangled Banner, and then it would just go into a test pattern and a test tone. And during the day, when I was little, before I went to school, and on the weekends, a lot of what they showed were old movies, old black and white movies from the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So here I was living in the 50s, but I was being indoctrinated to the popular culture of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and the Laurel and Hardy movies, and all those sorts of things. And there was one catchphrase, and you may remember it, but there was a band leader named Ted Lewis. And he used to step up to the microphone before his orchestra started playing and say, "Is everybody happy?" like that. And then they would start playing. And that phrase became so popular that it spawned two movies and a song, just by him with his inflection stepping up to the mic and saying, "Is everybody happy?" But I think the reason for that is there's a deep underlying excuse me, appeal to this idea of being happy, that this is something that all human beings recognize as a desire or a motivating force in life. We move to be happy. Emma Curtis Hopkins says we all recognize that there's a good in the universe and we ought to have it. And whatever we do is in some way, shape, or form, whatever we do is an attempt to reach our good, to have our good, to experience our good. So if we move, we're moving because we think by moving we will experience our good or our happiness. And if we sit because we think by sitting we will experience our happiness. Now that doesn't mean that everything that we do is going to lead to happiness, but it means that there's this universal desire in life. There's something within life that people recognize. There's this something that is called happiness. There's this state of being happy, happiness, and it's for everybody. For everybody, not just for some, and not just for those people over there or these people over here, but everybody. Is everybody happy? And even in our Declaration of Independence, the Declaration says that it is one of our God-given rights to pursue happiness, to pursue it. And I thought that is an interesting choice of words. They didn't say it's our God-given right to be happy. They didn't say it's our God-given right to experience happiness. But they said it's our God-given right to pursue happiness. So why would there be a difference? Why would we say, well, you can pursue it, but you don't have a right to be it? Isn't that interesting? And I think where the answer starts to come from is there are so many different ways of describing or understanding happiness that everybody has a different opinion. It's like we talked a couple of weeks ago about love. Everybody agrees that there's something called love, but not everybody agrees on the same thing. Not everybody has the same understanding of love or the same definition of love. And we talk about it and sing about it, and we talk about happiness and we sing about happiness and we make movies about happiness. But happiness is not necessarily a tangible thing that can be weighed and measured. It is more as a waypointer. This concept of happiness is pointing us toward something else. And if we can get beyond the confusion of our language and start to reflect upon, well, what is that something else? You know, maybe we're all trying to say, look that way, look towards that something else, look towards that which is beyond, when we use the word happy. Then maybe we'll come to a different understanding. This idea of pursuing happiness, and one of the traditional or dictionary definitions of happiness, which comes from the material view of the world, the transactional view of the world, when you hear me talk about the three levels, is that happiness is a result of attaining something. It's a happiness of succeeding at something or achieving a desired goal or getting something that we wanted to get, you know. So in this case, then, happiness depends upon some type of an external event or an external object, you know. When I get that job, I'll be happy. When I move to that city, I'll be happy. When I buy that certain car, I'll be happy. When that certain someone loves me, well, then I'll be happy. And now you can start to see where the pursuit of happiness can make sense. If you believe that happiness is based on something external that needs to be obtained, an objective to be won, a goal to be reached, well, yes, then you have the right to pursue it, you know. But even then, I would say, well, why did they limit it and not say that you have the right to experience it? But I believe it comes from this idea that happiness is based on achieving something. There's another thing that kind of ties into this when you start to look at what did the great thinkers of the world, the great thinkers who wrote the great books of the world, the philosophers, you know, of the world, what are they talking about when they were talking about happiness? And you start to get into some very, very subtle differences when you look at them and you read them. And kind of we move away from the idea that happiness is a goal to be pursued as much as happiness is not a goal to be pursued, but happiness is just a consequence of living your life in the right way. Now this is, you know, kind of the very moralistic philosophers, and they were talking about, you see, they're saying, well, you shouldn't do things just because you want to do them to experience happiness. You shouldn't do things because you want to do them to be happy. You should do things out of a sense of duty. And if you do things out of a proper moral sense, which in their view was to do them out of a sense of duty, and if you do them in a moral and an ethical manner, then it's inevitable that you will be happy. And of course, that's just their opinion, right? That's just their view of the world, that, you know, that duty takes precedence over happiness. But their point, I think, is something to consider. Is happiness something to pursue, you know, in itself and of itself? Do we do things simply just do the things that'll make us happy? Or is happiness something that happens kind of as a byproduct of the way we live? And I would add to that perhaps a byproduct of the way we are. In other words, perhaps we're not happy because we've achieved something. Perhaps we're happy because we are happy people in the first place who achieved something. Now you start to get into then all of these different philosophical questions about happiness. We can recognize then that my idea of being happy is different than your idea of being happy, and those two ideas are different than everyone else in the world's idea of being happy. But yet there's this common agreement that this thing called happiness exists and we ought to have it. But we come into some greater confusion, because what happens if we have two different desires and we think that pursuing each of those is going to afford us happiness, let us attain happiness, let us achieve a goal that is going to bring us happiness, and those two goals or those two desires are in conflict with one another. So suppose my one desire is to eat a lot of high-calorie foods, and my other desire is to be physically fit. You can see then that I've created a situation where my desire to be happy now makes me unhappy. If I eat a lot of high-calorie foods, then I'm unhappy because I'm not as physically fit as I want to be. If I try to control my desire, control my appetite for high-calorie foods in order to achieve my desire to be happy by being physically fit, well, now I'm unhappy because I'm not eating things that I want to eat, So we get caught in catch-22. And here, again, I think the problem is with the definition of happiness. But the philosophers point this out. We've got these conflicting desires, and how do you resolve them? And I think part of the problem is that at the very first level, when we're talking about happiness as being an effect, an effect that is kind of thrown upon us when we finally achieve what we want or get what we want, what people are really talking about there is that happiness, their definition of happiness, or the definition of happiness at that level, is that happiness is the equivalent of pleasure or satisfaction. And they get them confused. They get pleasure and satisfaction confused with happiness. There's a book called The Art of Happiness, and it says it's written by the Dalai Lama, but it's actually written by a Western psychologist who went and interviewed the Dalai Lama and then wrote the book, and got, I guess, put the Dalai Lama on there as a co-author. And this gentleman had been studying his craft for years, and he wanted to go meet the Dalai Lama and talk to the Dalai Lama about psychology. And he got a series of audiences with the Dalai Lama, asked him many questions, and then he wrote the book kind of summing up his experience of the conversations. And in one of the first conversations, he said to the Dalai Lama, he says, what do you think motivates people? Why do people do the things that they do? And the Dalai Lama looked at him and laughed, that chuckle that he has, and he says, I don't know. I have no idea. And the psychologist was kind of stunned. He says, you have no idea. He says, you're the Dalai Lama. You're the head of the Tibetan Buddhists. Your people have been studying psychology for longer than Western civilization has existed. I came here hoping to find the secret of human motivation, and you don't know? And the Dalai Lama laughed, and he shook his head no, and he thought a little bit. He says, well, I think what motivates most people is to be happy. People want to be happy. And that's it. It's no more complex than that. People are basically doing the things that they believe will make them happy. Problems arise because their idea of what being happy is is not an accurate idea, not a correct idea. They confuse pleasure with happiness. So we tend to think as human beings, well, when I go to do the things that bring me pleasure, then I'm happy. Eat the foods, engage in the activities that are pleasurable, that is happiness. And because that idea of what happiness is kind of a little bit off, it kind of misses the mark a little bit. What happens is we do things that we think will make us happy that make us unhappy, that bring us misery, or in Buddhist terms, bring us pain and suffering. So in that very simple view that we get from Buddhism, the primary motivations in life are to avoid pain and suffering and increase pleasure. That's where human existence at kind of the first level of consciousness exists. That's what we're trying to do. So, for example, he gives the example of addictions, or substance. We find some substance and we think that, well, when I take this, it brings me pleasure. I take this substance and it's very pleasurable. Whatever it is, it could be a food, it could be a narcotic, it could be alcohol, it could be anything. It could be a person, it doesn't matter. It could be a place. But what the point is that our whole idea of being happy is now wrapped up on this external object. I must have that to be happy. When I get that, I'm happy, because we're equating the pleasure that we experience in this external event or this external person or this external substance. We equate that with happiness. There's a deep inner desire, a motive force, if you will, that moves us toward happiness, but we're still not quite sure what happiness is. So we go after pleasure. And then what happens is the very thing that was once the object of our pleasure becomes the object of our suffering, or the cause of our suffering. What happens if we can't get it? What happens if there's not enough of it? What happens if we can't afford it, you see? I have enough for today, but what about tomorrow? Maybe I need to hoard it up. Maybe I need to build a big stash of whatever it is, And now, instead of being happy, now we're suffering. Now we're involved in mental anguish. And the Dalai Lama goes on to say that the real difference, if you trying to figure out, well, what in the world is the difference between pleasure and happiness? We use the term happiness when we're talking about something that's pleasurable, but that's not the ultimate definition of happiness. That is a definition of happiness. And the Dalai Lama said, if you start to think about things in the long term rather than in the short term, you might start to see that which is pleasurable is a short-term experience. But that which lasts for a long term is the thing that's going to lead us to happiness, lead us to a greater experience of happiness. And and it makes great sense to me. So you start to think about what he's talking about in this book, Well, yes, I can go for this thing that's going to give me a great shot of pleasure for the moment, whatever it happens to be. Have that candy bar or whatever it is, and I'm going to feel really wonderful in the moment. But in a little while, the sugar high is going to go away. I'm going to start to feel miserable. I'm going to want another hit of sugar, and then I'm going to feel bad about myself because I'm not working towards my physical fitness desire thing. So what do I do for the long term then? What do I do for the long term? If I start to think about, well, do I engage in the things that are going to bring happiness over a longer period of time, then you can see how just at a psychological level, not even a spiritual level, but at a psychological level, we start to change the decisions that we make. So the first level of happiness, or the first level of defining happiness, is attaining something, getting our hands or getting our experience around something that is out there. And then some of the philosophers said, no, 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 no. Happiness is not an end to be attained. It's not a goal to be achieved. But happiness is the way in which we go about doing our things. It is the way that we live our life. It is the way that we conduct business. And this is where the idea of, well, if you're doing things morally and ethically, and if you're doing things out of a sense of duty, according to that particular philosopher's worldview, well, then happiness is the inevitable result. But the key idea that I would like to take away from that is that happiness isn't the destination. Happiness is the journey. Happiness is the journey. It's not I'm going to be happy when I get there. It's that I am happy right now in doing what I am doing, in the way in which I am doing it. I am happy. I feel a sense of satisfaction. I feel a sense of pleasure in doing things the way I do them, in doing the things that I am doing. And that takes us a little bit deeper, if you will. So now you can see how it ties into what I was talking about, what the Dalai Lama was saying. Instead of being happy because I went and I engaged in that thing that was pleasurable, I have a different sense of happiness, that I am living my life in a healthy way. I am living my life in a more satisfying way. I am living my life in a way that in the long term is going to be happier, rather than ups and downs and peaks and valleys of going from pleasure to suffering, from pleasure to suffering, those kind of things. Which, by the way, when we talk about human life is all about tension and release. Everything in human life seems to be about tension and release, and that just plays out in everything we do. And what we're doing as we're growing spiritually is we're moving away from that tension and release, and we're moving into a steady flow. So God doesn't have the peaks and the valleys. That which our concept of God is doesn't have the peaks and the valleys. It is. It is. It just is. It is everything. It is all powerful. It is all knowing. There's no lack. There's no need. There's no want. It just is. And we say, well, if it just is, then does it experience happiness? Because it has nothing to need. How could it be happy about getting what it needs if it doesn't need anything? And this is where we come into the flow. We come into the flow of the beingness. It is happy by its very nature. Its creation is its joy. It doesn't create out of a sense of need. It creates out of a sense of joy, out of a sense of experience itself entirely anew in some new and unique way. The oh wows, It's kind of, to me, it's the best way that I can explain it is, and I don't draw very well, but if I could, to imagine sitting down in front of a sketch pad with a piece of charcoal and just doodling and looking at what is appearing before me on the blank piece of paper and being delighted in it and saying, oh wow, isn't that neat? Isn't that wonderful? So now we're moving into this idea of happiness as not being attaining something out of a sense of need, but a sense of creating something out of a sense of joy. Creating out of a sense of joy. And this then leads us to the third definition. The third definition being the one of the mystics, right? We talked about the material, which is attaining. We talked about the mental, which is the process. And now we talk about the mystical, the being. That what we are really seeking, what this end of the motive force of happiness, what it is causing us to do. Stop for a minute and think about our desires. Our desires are motivations that cause us to do something. So hunger is a desire that causes us to eat. And eating can be very good for us. Certainly not eating is not good for us, and eating may or may not be good for us depending on the choices we make. That candy bar or the apple, it just depends. But hunger is a desire that causes us to do something that can be good for us. Eating. Thirst is a desire that causes us to do something that can be good for us. Drinking, depending upon what we drink. So the motive forces in our lives then are moving us to engage in something that has the potential of being good for us, depending upon how we choose to satisfy that desire, that motive force. So the desire to be happy can express itself or can manifest itself in our lives as a desire for stuff, for things outside of ourselves, right? Materialism, to buy things or to have certain people in our lives and all of the externals. Excuse me. The motive force of the desire to be happy at the next level can lead us to move away from the short-term immediate gratification and move into a longer term of happiness. And it gets us into thinking about the way that we are doing things. Not so much what we are doing, but the way that we are doing them, the reason we are doing them, the motivation for doing them. Is this thing, Dr. Holmes tells us, is this the question that we ask ourselves, is this thing that I desire, does it bring a greater experience of life and love and truth and beauty into the world? And if the answer to any one of those is yes, we say, well, does it harm anyone? And hopefully the answer is no. And we say, well, does it rob or take anything away from anyone? And the answer is no. He says, then do it. Then do it. Then morally and ethically it's good. It gives a greater expression of life. And he's moving us out of this get, well, I want to be happy, so I'm going to take what you have, and it's okay because it makes me happy. This justification or rationalization we see going on in the world. And it moves us into, subtly, it moves us into this, but I'm not getting, I'm creating now. See, I'm creating a greater sense of life and of love and truth and of beauty. And in actuality, we're not creating it. We're allowing it to flow through us. We're becoming more aligned then with the creative process of the universe. And then we move into kind of the idea of happiness that we would get from the mystics. And that is the idea that happiness is really the sense of being one with God. The beatific vision, they would call it in old school theology. The cosmic consciousness flash that Richard Maurice Buck would call it. Right? The mystical experience is what I would call it. What we really want, what is really calling us home, to put it in that language, is we desire to be at one with God, at one mint, not atonement, but at one mint. At one mint. Our problems, if we want to think of them problems, or our pain and suffering, or however we want to describe them, come from this idea of separation. We believe that we've been cast out of the garden and we've got to find our way back home. We've got to find our way back to the garden. I believe in actuality that we haven't been cast out, but we chose to leave. We chose to leave to go into the world to have all kinds of experiences. And in doing so, the divine experiences itself in every way possible through us and as us. But the inevitable destination of all of us is to return back into that experience of oneness. That's what's calling us home. That's the still small voice within. and it is leading us back home. So when we have the moments, when we have the moments of the experience of the presence, we experience the eternal peace that is there. Happiness is peace. Complete harmony in body and mind and soul. Complete peace. Complete stillness. Complete joy. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to attain. Nothing to lose. It all just is. So we experience the bliss. We experience the harmony. We experience the peace that passes understanding. And then all of these other false desires or false appetites, I think the Buddhists would call them, they disappear from our lives. They disappear. As the darkness disappears when we turn on the light, the mistaken ideas that we had about what it means to be happy or how to achieve happiness or how to pursue happiness, they go away, because we come to realize then that happiness is not an external something to be won or lost or captured or achieved, But happiness is a state of being that is within us. It is already there. It is the presence of God. And it is something that we can experience and we can allow to flow through us, regardless of the external circumstances. Remember, I keep mentioning Viktor Frankl. His book, Man's Search for Meaning, had a great impact on my life when I read it. I think I just sobbed for about a month when I read that book, because he was talking about his experience of being taken prisoner by the Nazis and sent to Auschwitz, and where his family was gassed and his friends were gassed and all the people around him were gassed. And he expected someday that his day would come to be gassed. And he made up his mind to be happy. I just shook my head. How could a human being be happy in those circumstances? And now I realize that happiness is not dependent upon the circumstances. Happiness is only dependent upon us. So what this comes down to then, the reason this kind of comes up now, is we would say, well, how do we do that? How do we be happy in a world that is full of circumstances that are not happy circumstances? And I'm hearing this from different people in different ways at different times. The world is confusing. There's a lot going on. Turn the news off because it's so disturbing, and all of these kind of things. And I understand that. I understand what they're saying. But I would just like to point out that there's an opportunity for growth there. There's an opportunity for growth. Because when we look at the world of externals and we think that they can make us unhappy, it means we are still vested in the idea that our happiness depends upon something out there, someone out there, circumstances out there. In our spiritual quest, right, we are all knights. We are all knights of the round table. We are all questing for the Holy Grail. We are all trying to find the chalice, the presence of God within us. Because that is what ultimate happiness is. Right? We remove the separation, the veil of separation that only exists in our consciousness and only we can remove. So when we see something on the news that disturbs us, rather than to be disturbed and say, oh my goodness, that really upsets me, we can stop for a minute and say, wait a second, do I know who I am? Do I know what I am? I am an individualized expression of God. And all of the power of the universe responds to my word. When I believe in my word, all of the power of the universe responds to my word. Just as it did when God said, let there be, and when God continues to say, let it be. So what is disturbing about the events and what is disturbing, I think, is we feel out of control. We feel victimized. Something's going on in the world that we can't control, and it's going to have negative consequences on us. And that is the opportunity to stop right there and say, my good depends not on the external circumstances, but only on my contact with the divine. Emma Curtis Hopkins goes so far in her book, and she was a practicing mystic. She says, I don't worry about my health because God is my health. I don't worry about my finances because God is my finances. I don't worry about my safety because God is my safety and my security. The biblical passages that tell us that 1,000 will fall at thy right and 10,000 at thy left, but no harm shall come to me. All of these promises start to come back, not to those because we say our prayers out of rote or out of the philosopher's idea, out of duty and moral obligation, but because we take the time in our spiritual practice to allow our consciousness to come into contact with the divine presence that is already here. Life is our path of growth. Somebody put a post up this morning. There's a quote from Rumi, and I just loved it. It says, I have come here as an invited guest for the purpose of figuring out what lies next. We have come here as an invited guest. I think we volunteered to come here. I think we volunteered to come here because the circumstances and the conditions of the life that we were born into are absolutely perfect for the growth of our soul at this moment in time. But we must remember that we're invited guests. We're only passing through. I love Dr. Tom Costa gave a talk one time, and he said, we're supposed to pass through the valley of the shadow of death. We're not supposed to build a condo and stay there. We're only passing through. And when we see the things that frighten us, as we pass through the valley of the shadows, we have to remember who we are. We have to remember what we are. We are God's instrument of love. We are God's instrument of peace, and we are God's instruments of happiness. So I invite you then, as we go forward, as we go forward every day in this world, when people bring us the ain't it awfuls, understand that they are afraid. Don't condemn them or criticize them or complain. Keep in mind that they are doing exactly what they think they need to do to be happy. And you and I, when we get caught up in it and we start to condemn and to criticize and complain and be afraid and all of these kind of things, we too at that moment are doing exactly what we think we need to do to be happy. But we are going in the wrong direction. We are sucked into the idea that happiness depends upon the externals. And that is an opportunity right there and then when we catch ourselves doing that. It is an opportunity to clear, to go within. Right? As Joel Goldsmith says, take a God break. Even for 30 seconds, take a God break. To just stop and recognize, no, that is not the truth of my being. That is not the truth of who I am. The very presence of God is right here. The omniscience, the omnipotence, it's all right here. It's all right now. And it responds to my word according to my belief, and my belief at this very minute is that I am filled with the peace of God, that no harm can come to me, that no external circumstances can affect me. Like Shadrach, I can be in the furnace and be unharmed by the flame. Like Daniel in the lion's den, I can be in the pit and be unharmed by the lion. Dr. Holmes tells us that learning to trust will make us happy. Learning to trust. So we all desire to be happy. We may have had different ideas of what happiness is, but now I hope that we recognize that happiness is the peace that passes understanding, the contentment, right? Contentment means I don't have any more desires. Contentment means all my desires are fulfilled. I want nothing. I lack nothing, right? The Lord shepherds me. I lack nothing. I am content. Learning to trust will make us happy. Learning to trust will bring us into the experience of the presence of God, because every time we catch ourselves doubting, we sow trust, we sow faith. Every time we catch ourselves doubting, we go back in and say, no, no, no. I will not be caught up in the drama. I will recognize the presence of God right here. I will recognize the power that responds to me, and I will use that power wisely. I will conduct my life in a manner. How I will do things and what I will do are those things that lead to a greater experience of happiness. I live my life as the spiritual being that I know that I am. As I see the results in my life, my trust increases. My happiness increases. My contentment increases. We didn't come here to worry about the state of the world. We didn't come here to ignore the state of the world. We came here to learn how to trust more deeply, to learn how to love more deeply, to learn how to be happy. So I invite you this week, watch yourself, observe yourself, catch yourself in action. And if you start getting caught into the talk around the water cooler at work, the ain't it awfuls on TV, the mess that's going on social media. These days, Facebook is like the old Bud Light commercials. Less filling tastes great. Everybody just yelling at one another. Let all that go. Let all that go. If you get caught up in it, stop and recognize the presence of God in you, as you, and through you. And if we all do this, we can proudly say, everybody is happy. And so it is.